Okay. Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the third PECSA Roundtable Debate. I am extremely happy that you have decided to share your precious time with us in order to define or maybe even redefine the integration code within the framework of the Jean Monnet, of the event that is organized within the framework of the Jean Monnet project EUShare. Now I would like to ask Professor Ewa Latoszek, President of the Polish European Community Studies Association, to open our today's event. Professor Latoszek, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. I'm very grateful that you shared your time with us during this event. This is the event organized under the EUShare project, which is financed by the Jean Monnet program, and the coordinator of the project is PhD Marta Pachocka, and I'm very grateful to all of you for gathering over here, and to Marta for taking care about the project, but I'm also very grateful to our partner in the project. It means Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Sorry. And thank you very much to Mr. Peter Wamela for representing the foundation and for coming today to our event. And I also would like to indicate that the involvement of PhD Aleksandra Szczerba-Zawada was also very huge to this event. Thank you very much. And I'm also very grateful to all speakers and moderators who came to us from Poland, from abroad. Thank you very much for taking your time to preparing the speeches, to coming to us and sharing your opinions about so many elements of our current days, as the new code of European integration and new code of actually being European. So I hope that you will be happy with our event. You will share the opinions. You will be active during this event. I would be very grateful for being active. And thank you very much for all other members of PECSA, Polish European Community Studies Association, who are present today also. Thank you very much to PhD Anna Masłoń-Oracz, PhD Olga Barburska, and also Aleksandra Borowicz from University of Gdańsk, because without your support, for sure we would not be able to organize this event. So, and Małgorzata Dzimbała from Katowice, thank you very much for taking the effort to come to Warsaw. So maybe now I will give the floor to Piotr Piotr Wamela, and once again, thank you very much for your support, because under the current circumstances, it would be very difficult for us to actually be able to fulfill the requirements from the agency and from the European Commission without the support, financial support from your foundation. Thank you very much once again. And the floor is yours, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction. Well, first of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this debate, which is co-organized by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. And we are very much pleased to be participating in such an important, significant event as this one. Due to unexpected obligations, Ms. Angelika Klein, the director of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation here in Poland, was not able to join us today. However, she asked me to represent the foundation. As some of you know, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a German institution that provides political counseling and education. We stand for Christian democratic values. In Poland, we have been operating since the political change of 1989. From the very beginning, we have been supporting Polish integration to the European Union. We believe that European integration is a very important issue. We strongly support the process of European integration. We believe it brought a great deal of benefits to Poland, to Germany, to whole Europe. That's very obvious for us. In the history of the European Union and previously the European communities, we have been dealing with many intense debates concerning the future of Europe. It's been often said, Europe is at the crossroads and needs reforms. Such voices can be heard also today. I reckon that changes are necessary. But it is important that the goals of ours, the peaceful coexistence of the nations, and the fundamental principles set out by generally accepted democratic values, and those resulting from human rights, from human dignity, as Christians may say, remain on the horizon. We see the role of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in creating platforms for free exchange of ideas where people of different views meet and their opinion clash. A sincere debate may lead to constructive conclusions for the future. We are shortly after the elections to the European Parliament. Eurosceptic parties have received relatively large support. The results of the elections weren't perhaps that surprising, but they will certainly lead to a change in the balance of power in the Parliament, the European Parliament. The consequences of the composition of the current political landscape are difficult to predict. So the question is, what impact will this have on the integration process, and what direction will the prospective changes go? It might be true that Europe needs a new modus operandi, a way and will to build unity. As the organizers put in the title of our conference, it needs a new code of integration. The search for this code is also a search for our European political and cultural identity. This identity may be an important factor in uniting the nations of Europe. I would like us to look for these factors of European unity. This is also the aim of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I think that today's conference will help us to achieve it. With that being said, I would like to express my gratitude to the main organizer of today's meeting, the Polish European Community Studies Association, PECSA. Dziękuję bardzo. Our partner, Warsaw School of Economics, the Jacob of Parodies University in Gorzów Wielkopolski, as well our honorary patronage European Commission. Moreover, I would like to thank Aleksandra Szczerba-Zawada, and Marta Pochocka for the excellent cooperation as usual. And Szanowna Pani Professor, dear Professor Latoszek, thank you also very much for the contribution to this conference. Thank you very much. I wish you a successful debate.
Piotr, thank you very much for your introductory remarks. Now I would like to move smoothly to look for this modus operandi as Piotr described it, and let's get started. The first panel titled The European Union of the 21st Century in Search of a European Identity ? I would like to invite our honorable speakers, Professor Tatiana Murawska, Professor Klaudia Wiesner, PhD candidate Andrea Circolo, and Professor Ewa Latoszek. Please join me at the table. Nie, to moje, ale tu są pani profesor. Prezentacji muszę się zapytać. Before giving the floor to our first speaker, let me introduce Professor Tatiana Murawska. She is a professor of regional and European integration studies at the University of Latvia. Since 2000, she has been director of the Center for European and Transition Studies, European Studies Master Program, Doctoral School for European Integration and the Baltic Sea Region Studies, academic coordinator of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, and finally, Jean Monnet Chair at Personam at the University of Latvia, as well as the former president of Latvian European Community Studies Association. She has been also involved in the EU, World Bank, UNPD, and CIDA research projects. Professor, the floor is yours.
This out, it will be easy for you. I will move this.
I'm not sick. I can.
Have you uploaded
I know.
something?
Yes, it's on the screen.
On the screen, okay.
Dear colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very, very much for the invitation. I use now already for the third time to come in spring to Warsaw on your kind invitation. It's every time a great honor to me, and I'm very pleased to share with you my thoughts. I would like to warn a little, since I'm getting to be, it was so many nice words Alexander said, but you can feel that I'm getting one of the dinosaurs, and that's why please stop me. I used to talk too much, maybe. It's not always needed. Anyway, let me start with the topic, and I'm really honored that you put me as the first speaker, which brings on my shoulders some of the responsibilities in this absolutely crucial environment that we have in Europe right now, and how I don't know, you managed to, you can keep as a secret, but how you managed to have this conference at these important events, the elections, the council meeting, the debate about the next president, the change of the European Parliament structure. So that is, I don't know how you do it. Maybe sometime you will write in your memories. Anyway, my topic is about the transformation of the EU, and I would like to, as I said, share how I see the situation and what, in my view, is important now to talk about. You have, of course, a very solid background in these issues, and that's why I'm not going to very deep details, but just to highlight what I think are the important and worrying trends. First of all, what is happening now, what we have to pay attention. We know that for decades, the European Union, as I put it there, was safeguarding political convergence with the liberal Western order. In other words, we work together in implementation, the vision of the Washington Consensus institutions. Neoliberal, post-war liberal, so that we were doing very successfully. Now, we also succeeded quite a lot in economic rules, regulation, and standards, where the most regulated regional setting in terms of the standards and standardization in the world. Actually, it's us and the United States. Then we also were sensitive to the national ambitions. We were taking care of the interests of member states and subordinated shared goals within the multilateral bodies, within the EU and as well as outside the EU. Now, one of the elements that I will return to it during my presentation, EU deals now with the United States and China that are increasingly mixed in economies, especially China, and with the very nationalist foreign policy agendas for both. Now, we have an external environment that dictates us to adapt and to maneuver. First of all, it's globalization that we now define a little bit different than in early years. It is digitalization. Let me put here also mediatization. I tried how to better construct the word, but the dictionary suggested mediatization. So it's everyday tweets, for example, that we receive from the President of the United States. And then I would like to show you, I like this idea to which Bruegel think tank in Brussels paid attention. Imperialism, put it in quotation mark, Lenin wrote in a century ago, is defined by 5 key features that people of my age know very well, we studied. The concentration of production, the merging of financial and industrial capital, exports of capital, transnational cartels, and the territorial division of the world among capitalist powers. And quotation is still going on. Until recently, only dyed in the wool Bolsheviks still found that definition relevant. And according to Bruegel, not anymore. Lenin's characterization seems increasingly accurate. So let us look at what is happening around the EU and a little bit within the EU, and see how this goes with the Bruegel intention to return to Lenin's definition about the imperialism. In globalization story, a few years ago, it was assumed to dilute market power and stimulate competition. Not anymore. It was hoped that greater economic independence would prevent international conflicts. Not anymore. We have entered a world now of economic monopolies and geopolitical rivalry. That we witness in different parts of the world, and too often that we would be happy to see it. We also can, and again it comes a little bit of Bruegel and researchers or scholars that work with Bruegel, the new raison d'etre of the EU, let me pay attention, it coincides with what I previously said. The exact composition of the newly emerging global economic powers is not yet clear, but it is now fully acknowledged that the political and economic relevance of the West is being rescheduled. It was said in 2014, it was new. Now, I think we have a proof that, that the scholars were right saying this. And then what Sapir suggested, that the EU external policy is a subproduct of internal consolidation. And that is one of the angles we are thinking today, how to reach this internal consolidation in the EU. We can also add to this picture, to make it even more complicated, that European community and later the European Union was as a regional international entity known with the relatively small number of countries. I put relatively small. We know that community started with 6 and then it was gradually increasing. Now what we have economic and political integration, which is much more than when European nations started their way to the integration. And where we are now, with all the previous assumptions, and with knowledge that we know now about European Union internal situation, we have a systemic crisis, political, economic, social issues and tensions. For example, it is now obvious that it's not possible to leave the EU. We have the situation with Brexit some time ago, trying to leave. I'm wrong. With a discussion about possible leaving of the Greek from Eurozone, never happened. Then we had a much more serious case with the referendum follow Brexit, no results for the moment, which means, again, that to leave the EU is not that easy. Integration is going on in a different environment that I already had mentioned. With the concentration and geopolitical rivalry, which is inseparable. For the moment, we have these trends going together. Europe's challenge now is to position itself in a new landscape where power matters more than rules and consumers' welfare. I believe we all agreed with this. Sorry for the typos, but I would like to conclude this slide. The EU project is not holistic anymore, and a new model is required. It's exactly what says the title of the conference, a new code. So we talk about the new code or the new model. In EU agenda or agendas, we still have the global agenda, a transatlantic agenda, and a regional agenda that it's needed to be always clarified. Just to add to this picture, in the regional agenda, we still are dealing with the trends of increasing regionalism. This is the picture taken from the World Trade Organization, which is now in discussion at the EU level how we can continue cooperation with the World Trade Organization, however, assuming that it's extremely important. Despite the fact that we were concluding, for example, CETA agreement or agreement with Japan recently, that not necessarily involve the direct involvement of the World Trade Organization. Then, of course, we can see that reality today is totally different from what it was in the previous times, about the international trips, about people living outside the home country globally, about cross-border online students globally. So the world is getting more and more tight and more on move. But what is important that we have in Europe, that if you look where Europe are from the indicators of the world, we talk about the most population growth taking place outside Europe. We have Asia, we have Africa, and we have Latin America, and then this is the position of the West. We have North America and we have Europe declining in many respects, not only economically, but also in terms of the population. As a global player, since I put at some point the agendas, we need to say and to admit that the EU remains a weaker player because we have international divisions, we have dependence on security guarantees that the United States provides, and we can reflect on it with the new budget that will be focusing as never before on the security issues. We have the dependence on energy imports still. And then the question is how we will get out of the situation or what we can suggest. There are a number of agendas. It's 2030, 2050, sorry. It's not 205, it's 2050. We have a number of advisory committees that are suggesting the European Commission what would be the best considered scenarios. And the Juncker's Commission plan and agendas were presented at the beginning of the work of the Juncker Commission. However, not everything, we know these 10-point plans, not everything is happening, and for example, digital common market is still on the way. Then the question is what needs to be done, like for example, balanced rule-based and progressive trade and investment agenda, international economic financial rules, labor standards with the ILO, which is also under the revision right now within the ILO. Then there is a Paris Agreement on climate change. Then we also have reflected picture in the European Parliament. We have demonstration. The young people now are very seriously taking role in the climate change within the Paris Agreement context. Then we still discuss the international cooperation with Washington Consensus institutions. And we need to restore a level of playing field. However, I put here at the title modeling through, which is actually one of the scenarios that is suggested by different advisory groups to the European Commission. So how we will be doing this? Good to have it more structured than the modeling through, but it's also one of the possible ways how we will be developing. It's important to restore a level of playing field. For example, the better enforcement of existing agreements and the EU rules. Protection investments, for example, the Commission proposal about the multilateral investment court, it's especially relevant to the story of CETA that on the initiated Belgium supported Austrian, for example, idea or the decision of the Court of Justice how much CETA and investment procedures in line with the EU legislation, and now recently the European Court of Justice confirmed that it's in line, which means that we can expect Belgium, Austria, and many other member states who are not still ratified CETA that they will ratify it. Then we have the trade defense instruments and political procurement, and the European Commission proposal is international procurement instrument, openness to foreign investments, tax justice, and transparency. I believe, I didn't put it here that innovation and research, but I believe that in parentheses we can have in each and every position, we can keep in mind the innovation need for that and the research. We also need cooperation, and we need to build a common platform to keep the European Union project. They need to increase the knowledge and understanding of the European Union among the population and the youth, especially. That's why I put in capital letters in the EU member states. This should be a high priority for the European institutions and member states as we are building Europe for the young people. So that's the final word that I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Tatiana, thank you very much for your informative presentation and for sticking to the time regime. I am deeply grateful for this, as this will allow us to give the floor to our second speaker, Professor Klaudia Wiesner. Professor Wiesner is a professor for political science at Fulda University of Applied Sciences and visiting scholar at the Harvard University. Klaudia's main research interests are European Union political theory, the EU's multi-level system, political culture, and policy implementation. As Professor Klaudia has already, okay, let me help you.
So how is it?
F5.
F5. Okay, good. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm really glad to be invited here, as it is my first time discussing EU issues in even Eastern Europe. So I'm used to debating these matters more in Germany or in the western parts of Europe. And I will speak about European identity in troubled times, conception and practice, which means that I will really dive with you for the next 10-15 minutes into the concept of European integration, asking what European identity is and why we would need a European identity. And then I will briefly finish on the relation of European identity formation and democratic practice. So this is very much on the level of democratic theory and conceptual thinking, but I will be happy to answer concrete questions on how this concretely could come about. The time will not be there in the presentation. So what is European identity? There's much talk about European identity, you all know that. But there are two preconditions based on normative democratic theory that I would like to underline here. So the first one is that if we want to further democratize the European Union, and I'm a proponent of this position, we need the development of a democratic subject, a demos. Democratic institutions and procedures must be carried and actively filled by a democratic subject that defines itself as such, at least to a minimum extent. And democratic identity in that sense means this kind of self-identification of the demos. Second normative premise is that democratic identity is democratic identity. It's not cultural or religious identity, so it has to be respectful of differences concerning race, class, gender, religion, or culture. So we are speaking about a political identity or political values, which must be as neutral as possible regarding these differences. So neither culture nor religion can define an EU political identity. And you will understand that this is a precondition when you think about the 28 member states that we have currently. So we must have a difference-neutral identity in order to make it work. What then is a European identity and where does it come from? There are a number of assumptions on how demos building and identity formation are related. And one, and that's particularly dominant in Germany, is claiming that a European identity is a kind of pre-political identity. And it follows that it has to exist before the EU can be further democratized. Meaning we can only give more rights to the European Parliament if we have more of a European identity. Now, my usual replic to this is that if Bismarck in the 19th century would have thought in these terms, we would never even had the inkling of a German parliament, because he united Prussia and Bavaria, and they were really far from having a common identity. The school of constructivist studies on nationalism, which is very much empirically based on how nations were being built, argues the other way around. Democratic identity can and probably will develop within representative democratic institutions. And this is very important to keep in mind, there is no such thing as a pre-political identity. Ernest Gellner famously put it by saying that for every seemingly obvious criterion for defining a nation, you will find one that contradicts it. So that means that what we are looking for, European identity, is a type of collective identity. It's not pre-political, it's socially constructed. It's a kind of, as Benedict Anderson said, imagined community. It's not static, but it's open to change. And democracies in general do not rely on a homogeneous people or nation, but on heterogeneous societies. Which means that it's not only in the EU that we have this problem, but even in the member states. Society is not homogeneous, but heterogeneous. Collective identities are not necessarily linked to geographical areas. So they can be, but there is no natural link. And identities are always complex and express belongings on all levels of human existence. So what we are searching for should rather be termed a collective pattern of individual identifications than a collective identity. That means, in a nutshell, European identity is a kind of collective identity that is socially constructed, it's changeable, it's not necessarily geographically fixed, it's marked by complex arrangements of belonging. It has an individual component which regards the micro level, and it has a collective component. It's the kind of macro level, meaning the things that we all believe in, or the things that our collective patterns of identification are linked to. And what we are asking for is what patterns of identification are linked to, or can be linked to the European Union. So if we want to know, and there has been quite some research on this topic, how much of a European identity is already present, we can look at the individual elements, opinion polls, Eurobarometer, value orientations, and so on. But, and that's a little bit less research, we can also look at the collectively shared elements, the patterns of meanings, the concepts, and the discourses. It's often debated as framing, so how is the European Union framed? And if we briefly, very briefly, look at these two fields, we can conclude that a majority of citizens supports EU integration, and approximately 50% have a kind of unspecific identification with the EU. I feel as a European, and so on. But we see differences as according to nationality, the socio-economic context, and the level of education. So, as you probably know, British people will feel much less European than the Germans. Better educated people will feel much more European than the less educated. And poorer people will feel less European than richer people. But a third point, and that's very important, EU citizens do not know so much about the EU. So it can be fairly asked, what is it then that they identify with? So they say, I feel as a citizen of the European Union, but then they don't know. What is the European Union, which speaks of a kind of unclarity of our analytical instruments here. Research after the meanings of European Union and the concepts related to it has revealed that European identity is constructed in discourses. It's related to definitions of us and them, and also to founding myth. We see that national and European identities are related, so people usually feel like being German and European, or French and European. We see that political elites have a central role in constructing European identities, and we see kind of national allied discourses, which led to what has been termed national EU concepts. But we also see increasingly, and especially during this electoral campaign, more EU-critical constructions and Euroscepticism. The Brexit discourse is a good example for that, where you have a counter-discourse where really an opposition between Britain and the EU was constructed. But all this tells us that there is not one meaning of EU-Europe, but the meanings of EU-Europe are contingent and controversial. So, to sum up, what is European identity? European identity means the self-definition of a demos. It has to be respectful of differences. It is to be interpreted as a collective pattern of identification that is socially constructed and will develop in discourses. It can be influenced by socioeconomic factors, structures, and the political cultures of the different member states. The definition of an other might be China, might be the US for the EU, and the reference to a founding myth plays a role. We talk about multi-level identity. It will necessarily be German and European, Polish and European, and so on. And we talk about different national models of European identification. My second point will be a bit shorter. Why do we need a European identity? We have a strongly developed trans- and supranational democratic polity, but we have also a number of, as I would claim, democratic deficits that require further democratization. The EU intervenes strongly in citizens' everyday life, and we experience what Jürgen Habermas termed a net loss in democratic substance, because more and more competences from legislatives are transferred to executives and to expert bodies. Now, if we talk about EU democratization, we can, on the one hand, regard institutions like the European Parliament. We can regard processes and procedures, elections, citizens' initiatives, but we can also talk about citizens' activity. Democracy is something that is made by citizens, and I don't think we should forget that. And this very point creates the link, the conceptual link to European identity, because we end up where I started. The EU needs a better developed demos, a democratic subject that defines itself as such, identifies with the EU, and is politically active with regard to the EU as a polity. Meaning we need more of a democratic European identity. Now, I'm fully aware that I raised a number of challenges to European identity that I cannot answer to in this talk, but I would like to underline that this means that we have two ways, two very general approaches to democratize the EU. A top-down approach regarding institutions and processes, and a bottom-up approach, demos building and citizen activity. And in sum, and these are my two concluding sheets, European identity is not a precondition for EU democratization. It does not have to exist before EU democratization can start. But it's linked to a successful or a sufficiently successful democratization. A development of a European identity will be an indicator for the quality of an EU democratization process, because we see how and to what extent democracy works. And on the other hand, that means vice versa, that we need a more democratized institutional system, because it would increase the chances of developing a European identity. And this is, I think, worthwhile thinking about. Every political activity directed to the European Union will actively contribute not only to the development of an active demos, but also a European identity formation and a stronger democratization. And let me maybe start with the last puzzling remark, or stop with the last puzzling remark. This means that any kind of demonstration against the EU is not negative per se, because it enhances debate about the EU. It can be regarded as a kind of political activity directed to the EU, and in that sense it's perfectly legitimate, and we might even welcome it. We can sort of extend on it in the discussion. It really depends on the character of it, but it's not necessarily negative to be, for instance, demonstrating in front of the European Parliament in Strasbourg. That's it. I hope I kept the time.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wiesner, for this extremely interesting presentation. Let's now proceed a bit further with the issue of EU values that you referred to in your presentation. I would like to ask PhD candidate Andrea Circolo to address the issue of the future solution to preserve the founding values of the European Union, the proposal of regulation protecting the EU budget against generalized rule of law deficiencies. Let me introduce very briefly our speaker. Since November 2017, Andrea Circolo is a PhD student in European Union law at the University of Naples, Parthenope. His research generally deals with EU constitutional law. His PhD thesis focuses on the protection of the rule of law. Currently, Andrea is also a trainee lawyer at the Italian State's Attorney Office in Naples. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. I want to start congratulating with PECSA for this conference. It's really wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation. There will be no presentation, so I will try to be clear so you can follow me. Since its inception, the community, today the Union, has placed as a leitmotif at the heart of the process of European integration the respect for those values which its own ratio existens is lacking. So these values form its moral and spiritual heritage, such tell us the preamble of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, and permeate its entire legal and institutional structure, including its policies. Article 2, TU, which contains this list, begins with the expression the Union is founded on these values. It is therefore clear from the outset that they do not constitute mere ideal and political statements, but they are an essential condition for the survival of a union of law, as the European Union has sought to be since the Lever Case Law. Moreover, the privileged position within the treaties, which is second only to the affirmation to legal equality between the TEU and the TFEU, is enough to recall its fundamental importance. Having said that, one of the values on which the Union is founded is proper the rule of law. This is in fact the backbone of every modern constitutional democracy. It imposes the effective observance of Union law on all those subject to its shadow cone, namely institutions and bodies, member states and individuals, natural or legal persons. Recent concerns about the state of health of the rule of law in EU has required the intervention of European institutions that monitor the correct application of EU law. It was therefore necessary to activate the specific procedure that the treaties allocate to safeguard the founding values of the Union that are listed in Article 2, and among which there is the rule of law. The so-called suspension clause, or Article 7 TEU, as you know, establishes that the Council may suspend certain of the rights deriving from the treaties, including voting rights within the Council of Ministers itself, to the offending state who violated the values referred to in Article 2 TU. The mere reading of the provision immediately makes it clear that we are faced with a procedure where the intergovernmental method prevails. The Council of the Minister and the European Council are in fact the only bodies delegated to ascertain the existence of the violation and to decide on the suspensions of the rights to the detriment of the non-complying state, while the European Parliament has decidedly a marginal role. Indeed, it intervenes in the activation of the procedure. It is one of the subjects entitled to request the intervention of the Council through a motivated proposal, in taking the determination, but only through prior approval of the decision of the Council first, then of the European Council. On the other hand, it does not play a role in the definition of the rights of the Member States to be suspended. So the use of a procedure very different from the co-decision procedure in terms of relationship between Parliament and Council is justified in the light of what has been defined as the sensitivity to sovereignty. That is to say, since condemning a member state is a very delicate operation, given its possible political repercussions, the use of the intergovernmental method is more appropriate because of the considerable room for maneuver left to individual sovereignties. However, at the time of its first real application, this mechanism proved to be ineffective in substance. The procedural complexities and voting thresholds made its use impractical. In particular, the unanimity within the European Council required by Article 70 to certify the actual existence of the infringement favors the emergence of alliances between states. The substantial failures of the current mechanism to protect the rule of law have called for a redefinition of the framework of safeguards, and the reference is to the proposal for a regulation on the protection of the Union budget in case of generalized deficiencies as regards the rule of law in the member states. This regulation aims to make access to European funds by member states subject to the effective application of the rule of law. The Commission has rightly pointed out that the European economy thrives to the fullest where the legal and institutional framework fully reflects the common values of the European Union. The proposal, which was recently adopted at first reading in the European Parliament, would allow the Commission, assisted by a group of independent experts, to identify generalized deficiencies regarding the rule of law and to decide on the most appropriate financial measures to be implemented. Depending on the extent of the deficiencies, the Commission may decide to impose, alternatively or cumulatively, measures like suspensions of commitments, interruption of payments terms, reduction of pre-financing, and the suspensions of the payments. In the Commission proposal, once again, these sanctions can only be applied after approval by the Council. But in the first reading that has just been adopted, Parliament proposed with an amendment that the decision on suspensions and revocation should be taken jointly by Parliament and by Council. If the amendment were to be accepted by the Council, Parliament and the Council would also acquire equal voting dignity in relation to the protection of a fundamental value such as the rule of law. This is not wholly desirable, but also predictable, because since the adoption of the regulation will have to be subject to the vote and amendments of Parliament, because it is adopted by co-decision, it is conceivable that Parliament will only vote for a proposal that does not exclude its presence from the decision-making phase of the sanctions. Among other things, these measures do not rule out the possibility that the member states will in any case implement their own programs created and or financed from EU funds and will therefore make the relevant payments to the final beneficiaries, such as researchers in the context of a study program, for example. While it is true that this mechanism is effective from the point of view of safeguards, it also raises more than a few doubts as to its compatibility with the treaties. If the objective to be achieved is undoubtedly laudable, it cannot be denied that the connection to the legal basis used by the Commission is indeed indirect and forced. Even from a mere reading of the rule, it emerges that Article 322 TFEU, the legal base chosen, only allows to establish financial rules on the modalities of implementation of the budget. Certainly not, on the contrary, to protect the budget of the Union against the generalized deficiencies of the rule of law. So it is clear that the legal basis chosen, which is limited to identify the rules for establishing and implementing the budget, is not suitable for reaching the second of the scenarios. As already noted, it is clear that this is an attempt to circumvent the difficulties that have arisen in the use of Article 7. Nevertheless, bending the legal basis in this direction would lead to the violation of another fundamental principle of EU law, namely the prohibition of abuse of law, which prevents the exploitation of a benefit resulting from formal compliance with the rule, since its use goes beyond the objective of the rule itself. Furthermore, it is not necessarily true that a systematic breach of the rule of law is detrimental to Union's budget. The regulation should have placed on the Commission the burden to demonstrate through the production of evidences, not only the causal link between the generalized failure to act and the damage to the European Union budget, but also that that conduct caused actual and effective damage. In addition, this is not helped by the excessive breadth of the hypotheses identified by the Commission, which could outline a possible breach of the principle of peremptory. Moreover, this mechanism runs the risk of taking into account factors which do not indicate systemic and systematic deviations from the principle of the rule of law, but just administrative managerial inefficiencies. in relation to which the suspension of European funding could be disproportionate. There are also a number of problems of coherency tied to the fact that the regulation limits this conditionality only to the respect of the principle of the rule of law. There is the possibility, which must also be verified, that the EU budget is at risk even if other fundamental values such as democracy, sincere cooperation, solidarity are violated. So, the objective to be achieved is certainly laudable, as we said. However, the remedy runs the risk of overlapping with the system which the treaties already provide for defending the rule of law. Idest, Article 7 TU. This regulation would in fact censure the same violations, systemic violations and not one-off, of the same principle, the rule of law, and in the same way, because in the suspensions of payments is nothing more than a suspension of right deriving from the treaties, the same rights that the Council of Ministers may suspend according to Article 7. It is therefore not clear how and when one mechanism should be preferred to the other. On the contrary, it is clear that the mechanism for protecting the rule of law and the EU budget is an escamotage to circumvent the revision of the treaties and the unanimity needed to reform the existing protection mechanism. We shall see whether this will be able to achieve the majority required in the Council, firstly, and then the court examination of legitimacy. In short, although the desire to defend the rule of law at all costs seems appreciable, it cannot be denied the perplexity that this happens in spite of obvious legal obstacles. Moreover, the intention of subordinating the protection of the fundamental values to intergovernmental procedures appears once again to be inappropriate. At the same time, the European Parliament's attempt to change the direction of the protection machine in the sense of its communitarization is admirable because it plays a crucial role and it proved to be more distant from the purely diplomatic logic of protection and closer to the effective and unconditional protection of values that represent the essential condition for the survival of the project of European integration. The impression is that it is no longer justifiable for member states to be unwilling to refer such situations to the Court of Justice. However, this must always be done in accordance with the rules of the game that the member states have set themselves. What is called the Copenhagen dilemma, that is the paradox whereby the candidate countries for accession are required to respect the founding values of the Union, the violation of which is not effectively censurable after accession, cannot legitimize the forcing of the procedures that the treaties allocate for the revision of the letter of the same. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you very much for this legal analysis of the enforcement mechanism of EU values and shedding the light on the problems that are caused by ineffective, in fact, Article 7 TEU. Now I would like to move to another topic that will be addressed by our fourth speaker, Professor Ewa Latoszek. Professor Ewa Latoszek is a full professor and the director in the Jean Monnet Chair of European Union, the Socio-Economic Collegium of Warsaw School of Economics. She is also the professor at the Warsaw Polytechnic Collegium of Economic and Social Sciences. Fields of her teaching and scientific interest are European integration, the EU policies, and Poland in the European Union. Professor Ewa Latoszek is going to address the issue of the European studies under the current instability and insecurity. Professor Latoszek, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have to take my glasses. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to this panel. And actually, preparing to this speech, I just thought to myself, okay, what should I add to the topics which already were presented to you from the point of view of European identity? And I decided that being the academic dealing with European integration and teaching these topics and researching, I should maybe try to talk about European Union studies from the point of view of the identity of Europeans, and also from the point of view of the current situation of this EU studies, because together with the situation within the European Union and together with the changing situation of the job market, also the situation of European Union studies changes no matter that, as we can see, these topics are being taught all around the world nowadays. And moreover, I mean, this conference which I participated 2 weeks ago, I mean the USA conference in Denver, and also the cooperation and my discussions with Professor Tatiana Murawska on this topic, actually to some extent were the reasons why I decided to talk about this. And Tatiana, thank you very much for your remarks. Actually, first of all, when we just think about the aim of these studies, the main aim of European Union studies is to provide the students with some analytical skills which will be helpful for them to understand the complexity of the European Union processes, policies, politics, and also to be able to analyze the issue of the multi-level governance and also the governance at the national level, as well as the electoral system, party politics, and public policies, and also understanding the European Union role in the current world, together with understanding how the policies and law of European Union influences our daily life and you know, our acting in the job market as well. And when we analyze the situation of these studies in different parts of the world, we can see that in United States, for example, almost every university delivers this kind of the topics, but they do not deliver the European Union studies as majors, but rather some different elements of EU topics within other majors of the specializations, providing some practical elements of these studies. I mean, providing the students the knowledge not only about the basis of European integration, the process of decision making, but also showing them how they can use this knowledge into their future job. So therefore it is a little bit different attitude than in European Union. And I also had the possibility to talk to my colleagues from Japan and so from other parts of the world, from Asia, from Japan and Taiwan. And over there, they actually, in Japan, they contribute the majors in EU, but they actually contribute it in Japanese. They do not cooperate with Europe, delivering these topics to the students. So therefore, here is, I think, the possibility maybe to think together about the future cooperation and changing the minds of the students when they think about this kind of the studies. In Taiwan, actually, they try to deliver some sectoral studies. I mean, the tourism of, like, for example, tourism of European Union and culture. And this requires also some courses on the basis of European Union, the background of the European Union integration, etc., etc. And what I also also would like to indicate that no matter the attitude of the academics towards the way of the teaching and the requirements from the students, I will tell later about the current situation of the studies, we have to admit that the European Union has, let's say, most traditional way towards teaching EU studies, because we still, actually we base on the program which was prepared by Maastricht University many years ago, and we still keep to this program. So therefore, from the point of view of the students, this kind of studies are nowadays too traditional. And let's first of all define the EU studies in generally speaking about the program. This kind of studies have some elements of being universal. First of all, because of the aims which I already indicated, and also because of the fact that these studies are interdisciplinary. I mean, they refer to many disciplines of human science, human sciences, and also the methodology of the studies refers to European Union and to the situation of European Union, but not to the European Union as an element of the world. So therefore this is nowadays the most characteristic elements of these studies. And there are of course some special elements which are added to this general program of the studies within, for example, Central and Eastern Europe parties, like countries like, for example, focusing on the question of security when we think about our eastern border. Yeah, and so therefore here we are much more focused on the relations with Ukraine than, for example, the Western countries, and also countries from the Baltic region. Over there, the focus is concentrated on the Baltic cooperation, I think, and therefore this is the difference. But the core of the studies is almost everywhere the same. So therefore, but what can we observe during the past few years? After the enthusiasm for this kind of studies in 80s and 90s, we now can observe that the demand for this kind of studies dropped very rapidly. And even at our university, we had to suspend this these studies as a major. I mean, we deliver the topics, we deliver the courses, but you know, the major is suspended. So what therefore caused this situation, and which actually what was the main reason for the current rather difficult situation of these studies? First of all, I think that the global political, economic and social changes, this instability which in the job market and in our lives, also the migration and refugee crisis. These are the elements which actually put into some instability also the EU studies, because people just ask themselves, okay, will European Union still exist? Will it be useful for us to think about taking this kind of studies because of the situation in the world? So therefore, will it be the knowledge which will be really useful for our future job? And also the European Union is at the crossroads, as it was already indicated. The situation connected with maybe even some power of European Union with the word has decreased. And also the legitimacy of EU also is now very low. The trust of people to the politicians has dropped. And under these circumstances, you know, the European Union studies as they are at the moment, you know, under the situation whether they should exist in the form which we are used to. And also there are some other elements which influence the current situation of European Union. First of all, the learning circumstances have changed also drastically with all this complexity, competitiveness, and also many sources where this kind of knowledge can be achieved. Internet is, you know, the source of the knowledge about everything what is connected with European Union, actually. So over there, the students can find almost everything what is nowadays covered by the EU studies. So and therefore, and also I think that these populist movements with this negative narrative have a very negative influence on the teaching EU. So therefore, what should be done actually to change the situation? In my opinion, first of all, this kind of studies should be made more alive. I mean, they should be much more business-oriented, showing the students how different elements of this knowledge which is being delivered to them during the studies is connected with the market, is connected with small and medium enterprises financing, with, you know, functioning in the business market, functioning in the market. And also, maybe we should also think, as they do in Asia, about these sectoral studies. I think that maybe some EU health studies, for example, will be of higher demand than the regular EU studies as they are at the moment. Some also studies connected with tourism as they do in Taiwan. And also, I think that some more case studies, more simulation exercises, more webinars should be also added to these courses, because they should have more often the character of seminars than the classic lecture. So therefore, it will increase the involvement of the students into the process of teaching, and they will feel that they have to be involved because they have to take out of this teaching more than when they get directly from us. And what is also very important, I think, is also something what University of Warsaw is and Center of Olga Barburska represents the Center for European Studies. They think about so-called, actually they preparing so-called practical studies, which under these studies they plan that the students would have a very good knowledge of practical knowledge of at least two foreign languages. They also will have the obligation to study for 1 year abroad. And the program will be much more adapted to the requirements of the job market. But in my opinion, one very important element should be added. I mean, people from the business should be involved into working over the program and should be also involved into teaching EU studies, because you know, this practical knowledge is required under this kind of studies. Because the employers is nowadays not very much interested in getting graduates who have this theoretical knowledge. They want people to be specialized in some special area. So therefore, this is what, in my opinion, should be done. I also think that maybe when we teach this kind of topics, this kind of studies, they should be added in between two other courses, like for example banking. There should be added some elements of functioning the banks within the European market according to the requirements, current requirements of this market. What else? I think that we should also think about keeping some regional studies. I mean the studies which are focused not only on the European integration, but also on the integration which goes in other parts of the world, because actually nowadays European Union stopped to be the example for the integration for other countries like it used to be in the past. And therefore, what is the final conclusion? I think that we have to think over our attitude to teaching, because we have to make the students much more competitive in the market than nowadays. And one more remark which I would like to add: the universities should be much more so-called civic universities than the academia. They should be much more focus on the relations with the civil society from the surrounding, listening to the market, listening to the job market, and just trying to have the impact beyond the academy, not working for academy, but academy should work for the civil society and for the students and for young people. And this is very important because, teaching EU is also very required nowadays when we think about the identity, because the education is one of the most important elements when we think about the Europeans being European. So therefore, taking into consideration the necessity of teaching these topics because of the current time and because of the situation which is going on under these popular movements, which we can observe the situation with the European Parliament voting nowadays, yes. So we should also think about giving people the knowledge which will allow them to realize that they are Europeans, but also to have the knowledge which will be acceptable by the job market. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Ewa Latoszek, for sharing your experience and your reflection on EU studies with us. Thanks to outstanding time discipline of our speakers, we've still got 8 minutes for discussion, so let me open the Q&A session. I do believe that there is plenty of comments that you would like to share with us, so please feel free to take the opportunity. Oh, yes, perfect.
I will start. My name is Aleksandra Borowicz. I'm from Research Center on European Integration from University of Gdańsk. I have to admit right to Professor Ewa Latoszek about the European studies, which are crucial for development of European identity. We have to admit that also our research center usually had also bachelor studies on European integration as well as masters. For now, we have closed both of them, because we went into the business studies more. It's like projects in a business environment. Of course, very strong focus is on European Union issues connected with projects, structural funds, and so on. But I have to admit that the dropping down number of students that are studying as a major field of European Union will not go into the line of European identity, understanding and feeling this idea of European community, unfortunately. I have a good example from our debate that we had conducted on the Day of Europe at our university. In our panel took part Professor Andrzej Stępniak, Mrs. Kidawa-Błońska, Jarosław Wałęsa, who was in European Parliament because he's finishing his work in Brussels, and we had Professor Orłowski. And after the discussion on values and principles that EU follows as general and also that are followed by EU, for example, in different policies implementation, there was a strong voice from students that they don't want to listen at all about what was in the past, what principle has European Union, because they only want to talk about the future of European Union and the opportunities that European Union create for them. And this was the moment that Professor Orłowski underlined that this is the proof and evidence that we have to talk about these basic fundamentals of European Union, because this is the route that we can create on this, the European identity that Claudia Wiesner mentioned and talk about this. And in my opinion, without the major studies on European integration, it will be very difficult. I think that we are the environment, maybe we are the group of academics that are strongly involved in these issues, and I think that this bottom-up work is very needed. This is just general remark because I have to admit that you are all right, of course, in this subject. So this is all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for your precious remarks. Any other questions? The one is there.
Thank you very much. My question is for Professor Wiesner about the European identity. I'm Diego Caballero Vélez, a PhD candidate of Political Science, European Politics and International Relations at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies of Pisa in Italy. And my question is, you mentioned that the European identity is both social and political construction, right? And I really would like to ask you, and going further, do you think that the European identity concept is currently being used by Brussels as a political tool? For instance, in the case of when we see a crisis in the EU, for instance, Brexit, okay? The EU is in the discourses of politicians in Brussels, we see how they talk about a strong European identity, you know? How member states should act strong in order to avoid this kind of crisis, no? But on the other hand, when it comes with the process of the enlargement of the EU, to what extent a strong European identity can have limitations, okay? So in that case, the EU doesn't talk about strong European identity, but more kind of flexible European identity, no? Because a strong European identity, in this case, could have limitations to accept other states, okay? That maybe don't have as strong characteristics as Europeans, no? So I would like to ask you about what is European about this double faced of strong or flexible European identity depends on what the European Union wants to reach, okay? So, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's important to distinguish at least two aspects. What I've been presenting is a kind of conceptual category framework in how we should think about and analyze European identity. From a social sciences point of view, with an analytical perspective, and from a democratic theoretical point of view. Now I have been mentioning that European identity is constructed in discourse, and those discourses, or the discourse contributions that you have been referring to, in my view, are part of this discourse. And I'm perfectly aware, obviously, the European Commission uses the notion European identity as a kind of catchword, as a kind of, I'm tempted to even use the word empty signifier. So it means everything and nothing at the same time. But you see similar attempts from other actors in the discourse. So I would say in the moment it's probably an open question what European identity should be standing for. So what I'm saying is that you should be, I think, distinguishing how you analytically and categorically define European identity in terms of research and in terms of normative considerations, and how actors in the discourse, be it the Polish government, be it the European Commission in Brussels, be it the German government, be it AfD in Germany, or whoever it is, talks about European identity, because they will all have their interests. So one of the first things that I teach my students when I teach them to deal with EU documents or other people's documents or interviews is that they must be aware that everybody who takes part in the discourse has an interest. Yeah? Or in terms of Austin and Speech Act theory, saying something is doing something. And I think this is very much true in the debate on European identity.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Okay, the last one, please.
So I would continue on the European identity, and you all acknowledge that the rise of populism might be a problem for the further development of European integration, but actually not all populist parties wants to go out of the EU, and they actually acknowledge that there will be a kind of European identity that is much more based on cultures. And my question is, do you consider it as a threat for the democracy in the EU? And if yes, what could be maybe done against it? Yeah.
Do I consider it a threat for democracy in the EU? Yes. Even as a German and as a political scientist, I've come to declare that Alternative for Germany is anti-democrat. I have gone so far as to tell people in public discussions not to vote for them. I don't normally do that, but those are anti-democrats. So they really want to undermine the principles of the rule of law and of democracy. And the same is true, I think, for not all, but many right-wing populist MEPs in the European Parliament. So I think we have a problem there. But it's, again, not a problem of European identity or cultural values or whatsoever. It's a problem of questioning the rules of the democratic game, I would put it that way. And I think it's a serious threat everywhere in Europe. So then I would like to say that I would differentiate two things again. I think it's perfectly legitimate, and I would like to underline that, to be critical of the European Union in its actual stage. It's perfectly permitted to say, I don't know, I want a Europe that's just an economic Europe, or I want a Europe that is a democracy, and I want to abolish the European Council, and I want to abolish the nation states. It's perfectly legitimate. It's different views, even of how the EU as a polity should be shaped. It's even legitimate to say, I don't want to accept the principles of representative democracy. But for me, my normative position as a political scientist and a pro-democrat would be that I would not be supportive of that. So what does this all mean for the European project? I think if the European project is not a democratic project, it is in danger, because it has been linked to the core values of the rule of law since its founding. So it puts the project per se in question. And this is where I see the danger, and not so much in a debate about the character of what the EU is. So I don't know if you see the point, but it's a slightly different emphasis in the threat that I see coming from the right-wing populists.
Thank all of you for your contribution to this panel. I think it's high time for coffee break, during which, of course, the discussion can be continued. But before leaving this room, let me remind you about our kind request to fill in the questionnaire. Of course, it is anonymous, just to let us know your opinion on the event and to let us make it even better and better every year. So thank you very much for this panel. Thank you once again.
Yeah, of course.
No właśnie. Czekaj, coś ci powiem.
I zakaz robienia tego na magisterstwie mamy.
No właśnie.